All right, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Sorry we're starting a little late, but trying to just make sure we're getting organized. I wanted to first say welcome everyone to our July AAHGS-GRVA meeting. Appreciate people coming out in person. It's a good thing to see familiar faces that we haven't seen in a while, and it's a good thing to see those people that are online that are a lot of familiar faces also. So welcome. And before we start, I just want to thank Joseph Rogers, who's our manager here at the Museum of Partnerships and Community Engagement, for making the arrangements for the facility. And this is really a great facility. So for those of you that haven't been here or online, if you get a chance, make sure you come to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, because they got some great things here. It's great information here, and I think they're doing a lot of reaching out to our community to make sure that we're inclusive in the history of Virginia. So with that, I'm going to go over a few technical meeting items just to get started. And then we're going to have Joseph speak. And for those of us that are here in person, he's going to provide a tour once we're complete with the meeting. So first of all, I sent out an agenda. Hopefully you got it. If not, it's up on the board. And just wanted to say our minutes for the meeting previously in May, we don't currently have our recording secretary has had some other issues that she's dealing with. So we need to catch up on that. And we'll talk about the recording secretary position. Our treasurer, Robin Jones. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Rob.
That's provided information on our current balance was $1,639.83 as of the end of June. We're still collecting membership, so it'll hopefully go up. So speaking of membership, our membership chair, Ron Stiles, has reported that we have a total membership roster as of today, 95 people.
Well, all right.
Wow, wow.
And we are collecting applications today, so we can add on to that.
We might be 100 by the end of the day.
That's right. So that's great. And thank you, Ron, for all the work you're doing on keeping that straight. I know it's a bit of a challenge. So I also wanted to talk about our program committee, our program chair, Jackie. Where are you? She's in the back there. Is working on filling in our program for the rest of the year. And at this point, we do have openings for the rest of the year. So we want to make sure that if you have someone that could provide presentation that'd be of interest to the group, please let us know. Contact Jackie or myself. We have a lot of interesting information, I'm sure, floating around about Virginia and genealogy and ancestry today. So let's make sure we give people an opportunity to share that information. We have a lot of people, thank God, online even, that are not in the region, but are of interest to what's going on in the region. So we want to make sure we reach out to them and provide information. Okay, I wanted to go over just a few items. First of all, we have officers of election coming up. Every year we elect officers. This year is the president, treasurer, and recording secretary positions that are open. Currently, the president and the treasurer have fulfilled our duty of 2 consecutive terms, 4 years. So we can no longer serve in those positions. So.
Let's change the rules.
Rules are not made to be broken.
I'm making motion.
I'm sure have very capable people in this organization that can work in those positions. And I think we're not going far. We'll be of support to anyone that's interested. So at this point in the process, we need some people to sort of work on the committee for putting together the ballot for the election. The election has to happen before our November meeting, November 6th. So we're looking for volunteers to at least work on strong arming people to run.
Be subtle.
I'm sorry. Asking people to run and seeing if people are interested. So if some people would want to volunteer to help coordinate that process, I would appreciate that. And you could just see me now, or you could see me later. Let me know if you're interested. It's not really a difficult process because we vote online, so it's really just coordinating names and people. Was it your hand up? Was your hand
I'm
up?
strong arming.
I think you're a good candidate. All right. Just on your good information side, we've got a grant of $5,000 from Virginia Humanities to rebuild our website.
Great.
We have already met with 3 different vendors to create the website, and this coming week we're going to make a final decision on the vendor that we want to go forward with. So this idea is to just make our site a lot more inviting, provide a lot more information, make sure that we're getting things out like upcoming events. We're making sure that people are aware of any kind of thing that's happening in terms of genealogy in our area. I think there's a lot of promising things we can do in sharing information online, especially for those people that are not in the area, but also for people in the area. So yes.
Could we suggest a genealogy and history, kind of expand a little bit in people's thinking about these are the kinds of things we'd be interested in learning?
Yeah, if you can explain.
Excuse me.
If you can explain.
I'm suggesting that when we talk about even things like finding great speakers to address us and to teach us, or I'm just suggesting to the group that we could expand our thinking beyond genealogy, but genealogy and history, because they're wed, they're
Yes.
sisters and
Yes.
brothers.
Yeah.
So that's all I want to say.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that we learn a lot about genealogy through history and vice versa. So they are all tied. So you're right. We want to make sure we push the history part of what our mission is, as just as important as genealogy. Okay, and everyone will be aware once we decide and once we get started with the website. Hopefully that'll be done by the end of the year, and there'll be a lot more attractive for people to come and check out what we're doing. The other item I wanted to talk about just briefly was our national conference. The August National Conference is in October. And unfortunately, if people are not aware, we have a new president for August National. Her name is LaJoy Mosby, and she's actually online today.
Hi.
LaJoy.
Thanks for joining us.
I don't know, LaJoy, you want to
Morning.
say anything?
Yes, quickly, good morning, everyone. Thank you for this hybrid experience. Here it goes. Thank you for this hybrid experience.
Hold on a second.
Congratulations on your grant with the Virginia Humanities. I think that's wonderful. And I look forward to hearing about your 100 members at some point. And so, and I hope all of you will participate in our national conference.
Hold
coming
on,
up.
LaJoy, one second.
The speaker is.
I'm sorry, did you not hear me?
We had a slight problem with our speaker here. Hold on one second.
Try one more time.
Go ahead, LaJoy.
I just want to say good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Congratulations on your grant, on the wonderful work you're doing and this hybrid meeting this morning. I hope you are able to attain your goal of 100 members because that is a wonderful goal to have. I want to congratulate Larry for his tenure as chapter president and all the officers in the Greater Richmond, Virginia chapter. We hope that you will join us for our national conference in October. So it's a pleasure for being here, and I'll stop talking now so you can get on with your meeting. Thank you.
Thank
you. At some point, hopefully we'll all be getting together in person again in our national conference, hopefully next year. This year will be virtual, but the conference is a wealth of information. So if you had never attended, make sure you attend. As a member, there's a discount membership, discount code. So you want to take advantage of that. There's a lot of great speakers. I'm not sure, are you speaking this year, Raula? Okay. There are some people that are members of our chapter that are also speakers.
Maybe Shelley.
Shelley? Not,
No, I'm not.
okay. There is some great speakers that that'll be there, and you learn a wealth of information. So make sure you check, go to AAHGS.org and look up the information for the conference. Okay, I think that was it for items. I don't know if anyone had any questions or concerns before we move on to our speaker.
Page. I had to swap the sharing again anyway.
All right, so go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, you want the page up, right?
That's okay.
Okay.
We're okay. So today's presenter, as I mentioned, is Joseph Rogers. He's the manager of partnerships and community engagement at Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And he will speak on legacy of Black history makers. He'll dive into his family's exploration of their genealogy, its importance to them and its effects. He'll speak on his learning about James Apostle Fields. Fields was a prominent lawyer and member of the Virginia House of Delegates in 1879 and 1889. He was born in slavery in Hanover County, Virginia. He escaped slavery and was among the first students at Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. He eventually received a law degree from Harvard University. And so Joseph will talk to us about that. And then Joseph will provide us a tour of the museum, which after 2 years of renovation, reopened with a focus on all the stories of all the Virginians. And Joseph will show us some of the updated facility with the introduction to new available experiences and exhibits on display. So I welcome Joseph.
All right. We're going to have to do it the way we're going to do it. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen very quickly so that I can reshare it the way that I need to in order to make this work. No. All right, can everyone hear me both virtually and in person? Good, thumbs up if we can.
Keep
Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to be completely upfront and frank with y'all. I think that this is a fantastic experience to share some of my own personal explorations into my family's history. And I wouldn't necessarily classify it as a lecture per se, but I am very happy to share as much information as I can. Now, I will also note that because I was down here earlier moving tables around, I forgot to run upstairs and grab my notes. So we're going to see just exactly how much I have remembered off the top of my head based off of the PowerPoint slides. All right. So if I do get anything just a little bit mixed up, I promise you I will make sure that I correct those, make those adjustments and get that information correct to you. A couple of things that I do want to share with you all about myself before we even get started, though, that will impact this particular program. One, I am the son of a Baptist preacher. So if I get a certain cadence going every now and again, if I get a little bit of a shuffle going, you might realize a little bit of where that's coming from. So I wanted to give that a little bit of a forewarning before we even get started there. And then two, I also am a former intelligence specialist with the United States Navy. And as such, when I create PowerPoints, I still have this presenting to the commander style, which is very much not to say what's on the screen, but to actually assume that everyone can see it, read it, and then I will add explanation onto it. So if what you see on the screen are to augment and supplement all of those things together. But with that, I do want to welcome you all to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. As my boss has started to say, my boss Jamie Bosket has started to say, your state history. Now, we can say definitively that it has not always been so. There was at various points in time whether or not we were going to feel like we were all part of the Virginia then Historical Society, and whose stories were being shared at that society was not always reflective of everyone who is in Virginia. Well, with this major renovation that we've had after $35 million gone and 18 months, we are happy to say we have really started down far along the path to making sure that all Virginia voices are heard. But we're not there yet. The work continues, and that's going to be an ongoing theme throughout all of this. So I wanted to again introduce you to that, and then let us get started. The first things first, who am I? I think that that's an important point for us to bring up. As I've mentioned before, oh, no, are we not doing it? We're not doing it. I want to make sure that this is, oh, there we go. All right. My name is Joseph Sharif Hakeem Rogers. I am the manager of partnerships community engagement here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, but I am also a descendant of a man named James Apostle Fields, or as my mother, who is also in the virtual audience right now, want me to make sure I am a descendant of Martha Ann Fields. Now, she is both the matriarch, as in she is the first person who appears in our family as the oldest, and she is also the line through which our family really gets its sense of perseverance and ongoing engagement, the indomitable spirit, as George Washington Fields called it. Now, of course, if you have met my mother, Regina Rogers, you will know that she would never let me, she would never let any child of hers not get involved in history. And so there's a little bit of evidence to that effect. When I was 3 years old, as pictured in this little picture on the left here, that is where my mother was bringing me around to the Booker T. Washington National Historic Site. Wow. And so there I am at 3 or 4 of this picture, and I am dressed as Baby Booker himself. Wow. Running around the plantation. Hey, Baby Booker, there we go. And my mother, who had taken up quite a bit of engagement herself in doing living history programs, playing Booker T. Washington's mother. Those are my first experiences with history. Included in that experience is also when we moved to Philadelphia, when we worked at Independence National Park. I guess she worked, I was just there. And that was one I wasn't technically allowed to work at. But while at Independence, I, got to be just that close to the Liberty Bell. I will report that I got a little bit closer, as 6 and 8 year olds are tend to do. And I may have, there's no solid evidence of this, but I may have ducked my little head inside the Liberty Bell, and I may have licked it. But for the Park Service's purposes, there is no such thing that happened back in the day when there weren't as many guardrails around the spaces. But this is all to say that I am truly steeped in the history. Due to the raising from my mother, the involvement of my father, Lewis Rogers, the 2 National Park Service Rangers have been extraordinarily influential in my life and my heart. And so, even though from time to time I would seem to venture away, I went to school for theater actually, and then I joined the Navy, as we said before. When I came back to Virginia, when I moved down to Richmond, it was history that drew me back in. And so as we look at the pictures that are on here, we have the reason why I'm having this conversation with you all today is because, one, the effects of the teachings of my mother, my grandmother next to her, Margaret Johnson Cason, and then of course this other image of me here. These pictures are all from 2019, when I was invited to portray James Apostle Fields at the commemoration of the 400 years since the arrival of the first Africans in English-speaking North America at Fort Monroe. And so at that point, I was pulling on, and I've been doing this for a long time now, as you see those images of me as 3 years old, I had been pulling on that theater background of trying to bring to life a person from the past. And so in 2019, as I'm trying to find out more, how am I going to portray this person? What am I going to do in this sense? I had to dive back in to our family's history. And thankfully, as I was doing that, there was quite a bit to work with. I could read the book I could read through newspapers. I could look through various articles online. I could find a lot about it. In fact, the family's stories included some from my grandmother's mother, her name being Margaret as well, but Margaret Fields Johnson. Her story is not necessarily about James himself, but about James's brother, George Washington Fields, and how after he had lost his sight, she didn't, as a young girl, she would cross the street to get away. Because for folks who were visually impaired, such as George Washington Fields, in order to find out that it was little Margaret there, he would touch her face, and little Margaret didn't particularly like that. So there were times in which the people with whom I had interacted with enslaved people. And that was something that formerly enslaved people. And that was something that I really took to heart. Because it was important to remember that in the the commemoration of the 400 years since the arrival of the first Africans in English-speaking North America, that we are not so far removed from the period of enslavement. It was important to bring that into those portrayals as well. And so in this particular image where I'm very much invoking a spirit in this moment, I felt I needed to know more about the man who I was calling on. So, James Apostle Fields, who was he in the first place? And how did we even know what we knew about him? Well, for one thing, there were those family stories, the family traditions, and not, although I will say outright that my family has a very interesting habit of saying, oh, your grandfather did this, or your uncle did this, and that was nice. But the expectation is for you to do something as well. And so when you would hear stories about anyone in the family, you would always hear, yes, that's a kind of a passing thing. But what really the important parts is not necessarily the achievements, the accomplishments, those things that we racked up on a card that you might find in Encyclopedia Virginia, but instead how they treated others, how their relationship was, how proud the family were to talk about them and how they connected with them directly. And I think that is a theme that actually recurs throughout this as well. Newspaper articles. I was very much going into the Library of Virginia's historical archive a lot. Because James happened to be someone who was elected to the General Assembly, his name pops up quite a number of times in those newspaper records. And so we were able to find many different things on him or talked about him through being able to go through those, the Virginia Chronicle archives and being able to see direct in print what people were saying about him in the time in which he was alive. And that is not exactly a common thing. We also had school records and archives. So James had attended Hampton University, was part of the first graduating class there. And as such, his story appears in quarterlies such as the Southern Workman. His name appears in an article or a dispatch that was compiled 22 years in Hampton, 22 years of teaching in Hampton, Virginia, talking about the first 22 years of the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. And so he is appearing in that as well. But what really, really allowed us to know the most about James, give us the most rich and I think vivid storytelling about James, was his brother. His brother, George Washington Fields, that man that we called her Muggins, my great-grandmother used to cross the street from. He happened to write an autobiography. And so, because he was able to write that autobiography, we have more information about James in a narrative way than we do about just about anyone else in our family. And so that was an incredible bit of addition for us to be able to compile it. Now, keeping in mind that some of the things that George is writing about James about, he's remembering from when he was about 8 years old. James was his older brother, 10 years his senior. James also had himself seized his own freedom before the rest of the family did. And so there is a bit where, George Washington Fields is recalling how he was told, and also we have to take with a little bit of salt the fact that this is an older brother who's relaying a story to the rest of the family, right? So we are looking at that in both contexts. But because we were able to have all of these different types of documentation, again, here we have the actual 22 years of work at the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. And here you see where they interviewed James himself. And so you can read the entire article there where it talks about his accomplishments, because they're saying, what is it that is going on with our former graduates? How have they progressed in life? What are their thoughts on the condition of the Negro in Virginia at this point? And so James gives his thoughts on that. He records on this. These are some of the only times we see in James's own words what he's thinking. And so in this too, we have the actual words that he is writing, a voice that he is given, in this moment, that in other ways does not exist. Like, so we have the Southern Workman, which is actually in response to the passing of Martha Ann Fields. 2 articles were written. It's a monthly monthly publication. And so from slavery to freedom, in March '92 they start, and then they continue in April of '92. And they talk about Martha Ann's journey to freedom. And because of this, we also have a very rich narrative for Martha Ann as well. But they mention in this James's escape. And so in the March edition, the escape from James does mention how it would be a story into itself to talk about his own flight to freedom. But then it also comes down to this final moment where it wraps up almost quite narratively how James, who has been separated from his family due to his own self-emancipation, is reunited with the rest of the family. And there were 11 children, only 10 of whom were alive at this point, but Washington Fields, the father, Martha Ann Fields, the mother, 10 kids who are left alive, 2 of whom have been sold away and to different counties, 1 of whom has been sold all the way down to Georgia, and then James, who has seized his own freedom, leaving Martha Ann with kids on a separate plantation from her father, from her husband, and seizing her own freedom with all of those children and a grandbaby in tow. Now, again, Martha Ann's story is one that we could go into, and it could be a quite interesting narrative. I could do an entire lecture about the Fields women, both born and beloved. But there are so many things in which she, in this moment, all of her family is reunited again. Because as I know many of us are well aware, some of the true horrors of slavery are not in the brutal beatings which James did receive, but in the separation of families, in the breaking up of that essential building block that makes us, that connects us with ourselves and our culture. That's why the work of genealogy is so important, and why the work that this group does is essential to the survival of the culture. But like I said, the #1 way in which we found out the most about James is through Dr. Claremont's book, The Indomitable George Washington Fields. And I did see that it was in fact online with us today. So I just want to thank you personally for compiling this and finding what you did. This is the copy of that book that my mother gave me. Wherein she lists the names of our direct descendants through the Fields family, from Washington and Martha Ann Fields, down to James, to Sterling, to Muggins, to Marquet, is my grandmother's nickname, through my mother, and then down to me. And this narrative is truly astounding. Because again, I am at this moment in 2019 attempting to find a way to embody a person who once lived. And I don't have all that much to pull from. It's with regards to direct quotations that he might have said. I've got those 3 lines, but I do have the narrative that his brother put to paper. And what an incredible narrative it was. So let's start talking a little bit about what George and what we can find about James Apostle Fields, starting just with his birth and his enslavement. Now, I want to give a quick moment to just talk about some of the language that I use when I refer to enslaved persons. It has been, we've talked about it in various ways throughout time. Someone was born into slavery. Someone was born at the time of slavery. Someone was enslaved. Like, there are various born a slave, right? Those kinds of languages. And I want to be upfront and honest with you all. I've never really felt comfortable with any of that terminology. It just didn't feel exactly right to me. So what I have started to use on a personal level is enslaved at birth. Because the system of enslavement is not something that simply just happens as if it's divinely ordained. To believe that would be the fallacy, and to actually think into the same line of the enslavers themselves. Enslavement is an action. It is something forced upon someone. No one is born a slave. They are enslaved actively when people choose to uphold laws that are unjust and inhumane. So when James Apostle Field was born in August of 1844, he was upon his birth immediately enslaved. And I can happily say that by 20 years later, he has, through his own actions, ended that enslavement. So enslaved at birth is how I like to use that phrasing for this in particular. Because as he was enslaved in August, he was the fourth of the Field's children. Hold on one second. Nope, my apologies, the fifth. I knew I had to get that one right. He was the fifth of the Field's children, the two older brothers, John and Robert, and then two older sisters as well. And they, as I mentioned before, three of them were already going to be sold off before the start of the Civil War. And so he was born somewhere on or around Clover Pines. He was, at this point, considered the property of a woman named Catherine, soon to be Winston. And when they would move up to, they moved relatively soon to Hanover, to a farm, a plantation just outside of Hanover Courthouse. So Hanover Courthouse is pictured here on the right, and on the left was something that I was able to find, which we're working out the finer details of it. But in the slave schedule of 1850, there is listed a woman under the ownership of Phil H. Winston at the age of 38, and a boy at the age of 5. These two line up in such a way that it would potentially indicate Martha Ann and James Apostle Fields. Now, remembering that many of the other children had already been sold off, and it's various points too. I have not personally yet found the rest of the family, because in George Washington Fields' notes, he says when he is born in 1854, he is one of 75. And so 75 owned by Phil Winston, that's a big difference between what we have here and what we have later on. So still got some things to work out. Again, the story continues, the work continues. But one of James's important life events is, of course, the coming of the Civil War, as it was important for many folks. By the time that the war breaks out, James himself is running close to the age of 17, going on 18 at this point. And he undertakes, George Washington Fields writes in his autobiography that one afternoon in fall, he shouldered a condemned or partially rotted rail, and that he took it to his quarters to make a quick fire with he being cold and his clothes damp. Keeping in mind, this is just part of a process that happens on a farm, especially in these kind of large plantations, where the rails that pin in the animals are taken up and then they're thrown away, they're discarded. And James has been working that entire day, and he's wet, it's been raining. And so he takes it back to his cabin, and he lights it on fire for warmth, to dry himself off. And George tells us then that that Phil Winston orders two of the overseers to tie James down. And then he afflicts him with a brutal beating that then causes him to, for the next several weeks, have his mother apply a salve to his back. This is a pivotal moment for James, because in that moment, when he is able-bodied enough and ready to go again, he says he can't stay here. He says that if I ever see Phil Winston again, I'll kill him. And he means it too, because somehow James has gotten in his possession a pepper box, a 4-cylinder revolver, and a bayonet, according to George. This is a man who is ready to put purpose and action to thought. But he knows too that that is not a solution that will just affect him. We understand, of course, that, and this does end up coming up as part of what happens later on. The true horrors of slavery, one of the many horrors of slavery ends up being that if the person who owns you dies while they are still in debt, everyone gets sold. You see that around throughout the era. You see it in auction houses, broadsides, Negroes for sale, to clear the estate of so and so. And so James perhaps has all of these things in his mind as he makes his decision instead to go into the woods. For several weeks, he stays out there. He is in fact tended to by his mother, according to the Southern workmen, who he comes back every now and again and just sneaks in for a little bit of food. And Martha Ann has been tending to other folks in the same manner, other people who have seized their own freedom, but who haven't gone too far just yet. And this network is important to keep in mind for when Martha Ann herself makes an escape, but also for when James ultimately makes a decision to leave the boundaries of Nutshell Farm. Now, I've chosen these images very specifically for this map, right? The actual images themselves are of the number of enslaved individuals in the then state of Virginia as it was in its two parts, including what is now West Virginia. And so you see where it gets a little bit darker, that's where there are more enslaved individuals. And so you see here, put through, and they're barely visible on our screen over here. I do apologize for that. I should have made them a little larger. You see where it says in Hanover in the top left-hand corner of the red dot indicating approximately where Nutshell Farm was compared to the Hanover Tavern. And then south of there, George says it's a 15-mile journey for James to take because he doesn't take the roads direct. But south of there in the county of Henrico is the city of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, where James seeks a sort of freedom for himself. Now, that's an interesting question too. Why then would James, for any reason, go to the heart of the South at this moment, the place that is besieged, the place that is the target, the place that has now one of the largest slave trading hubs remaining in the Confederate States after the fall of New Orleans? Why would he go there? Well, the answer is rather simple: family. His brother is reported to have been sold to by, in George's words, a quote, good master, who allows him to kind of walk around and do his own thing. Now, that is to say, we believe that John is hiring himself out. Now, if anyone is not familiar with the process of the hiring out of enslaved people, the way that slavery was continuing to perpetuate itself was through changing and evolving. It wasn't all about plantations and farms and the big agriculture. It was in many ways about, down at the Treader Iron Works, about actual creating of ordnance. About 300 people were enslaved at the iron works there during the Civil War. In other ways, it's about hiring out domestic help. In the White House of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis's house, you have hired out people who served as butlers, as coachmen, as anything you can possibly think of. The urban slavery was a different animal entirely, and one that was continuing to perpetuate itself and showed no sign of stopping. But because of this urban slavery, because it was a little bit too hectic for enslavers to keep track of everybody, there was a modicum, I'm not going to call it freedom, but a modicum of lenience to how you could move around. And so people could come and go and hire out their own services and then send that money back, not to them, but to the people who enslaved them. Free African Americans were often engaging in similar practices. There's a man who was a bricklayer down in Raleigh, North Carolina, who came up to work as a coachman for Jefferson Davis and the White House of the Confederacy. They're all high, and he was a free man, never having himself been sold. And so this is a place in Richmond where he can have some semblance of freedom, of control over his own destiny. And so there in Richmond is where he decides to take up his residence. And so for a while, about 6 months, we're told, that works out for him. But just like Phil Winston did not want his property, as he saw it, burning his property to keep himself warm, there was no way that he was going to just let James leave. Now, detectives were sent out, posters were put up, and eventually 6 months after James arrives in Richmond, he is captured again. Now, this is an interesting point too, because we have a point in the Southern Workman where it says that James was captured 3 times, and George only lists it twice, but maybe there's some clarification that we can offer with this. Because after James is captured, he's held and then taken by an overseer on the way back up to Hanover. Now, as he's heading back up to Hanover Courthouse, up to Nutshell Farm, they stop at an inn, a tavern, somewhere about halfway between the two. And while there, he has his wrists handcuffed and his rope tied around his ankles. And he is then, by the overseer, tied to a chair in the kitchen. And James is there, possibly pondering what he's going to do next, when a young woman walks in, apparently whose job it was to tend to this area. And he convinces her to loosen his ropes just a little bit. Just a little bit. And he does manage to get the rest of the way out. And then he takes off. He is running and running and running, and he is hearing the overseer behind him, knowing that the overseer has to be here right behind him, because he can hear the leaves behind him in the way. He's right on his tail. The entire way he's going and going and going, and then he finally collapses. And he throws up his hands and he says, "Stop, one more move and I'll kill you." And we know that James is already committed to doing these kinds of things, right? He's already thought about this, though. He knows what he's waiting for, and he knows what he will do. But he looks down, and he sees those ropes surround his feet, and he realizes that he hasn't been being chased at all. In fact, that rope has been dragging through those leaves this entire way. And what he was hearing was the tale of his own escape. But because of that, he's moved so far away from that tavern that he's probably in a good, safe space. But also, we're going to take a look again at this map. James has connections. He goes to 2 separate people. One, to get his handcuffs removed. A man that he knew because he was well acquainted with those in the area. And he removes his handcuffs. And then another who he stays with after having dodged Confederate pickets, dives into the water of the Pamunkey, the cold waters of the Pamunkey, and comes out on the other side, baptized but cold. And so this other man he does stay with and then gets warmed up. And the 2 of them together go to find the United States Army. And upon reaching the Army, they start helping them in their own way. And it said that James serves as a guide for a time. So I have on the yellow part of this, the yellow dot on this map, included White House Landing, which is an interesting space because there are many different people who are engaged in that, on that spot, including several newly self-emancipated, formerly enslaved people. And I want to bring that point up too, because while we don't have any direct evidence of where James went while he was a guide, where he ended up in that sense. I do want to draw attention to White House Landing for a number of reasons, because James himself did not appear to have joined the Army as a United States colored trooper. He did not join the Army in the same way that some others did. And so that rose a little bit of a question for me. Why not fight for the United States? Why just serve as a guide? Especially after the Emancipation Proclamation has taken effect and it is legal for him to do so. And since he spent enough time that he's there, he's only back in Hampton by 64, there was a moment where he could have chosen to enlist. But when we go back and we read the letters of Garland White, who was also from Richmond, but had seized his freedom a long time earlier, and now was fighting, had been recruiting Black troops in Ohio, but now in White House Landing, he says that there were a lot of formerly enslaved people, self-emancipated folks who didn't want to fight, who thought that they could do something else with their freedom. This rubbed Garland White the wrong way. He said, why would they not want to do this? Well, and that's a good question, because I think we often think about the fact that, since the USET were there when it was formed, many people did enlist. African Americans made up a backbone of the Union Army for a time, especially as they pushed into Richmond. So why then would a free man decide not to enlist? Well, because there are some reasons that you want to live your own life, right? Is joining the Army trading one form of enslavement for a different master? I think that we should, as we continue to talk about the United States Army and Black service in it, we should consider that too. It's an important part to remember. Not just the valor and the heroism, but the reasons why some people chose not to enlist. So after all of that, though, of course, James, by 1864, makes it all the way down to Hampton, to Fort Monroe specifically, in that area where he meets up again with his family. And that great reunion that was had, because like I said, all of the family is brought back together again. But following the Civil War, James has several decisions to make. For one thing, it has been instilled in him by his mother that he will get an education. Many of us know that illiteracy laws had taken effect, and so African Americans in general, not just free, not just enslaved, but free as well in Virginia, were not allowed to learn to read or write. It was punishable by law to teach them. And so taking up the kinds of traditions that have been passed on through folks like Mary Smith Peake, and in that same area, James got his education while also working at the same time. But most importantly, James goes to Hampton University. He attends there. He attends at the first graduating class, the class of 71. And so you can see in this this picture from the Smithsonian, the register is a little bit cut off on the one side, but right at the bottom, you can read that it is James Apostle Fields, because it does list his class, his name, the first part of his name, and then where he's from, as well as his age or his birth date. And so you get some of that information. You can see that he was there. But also, according to George, we get another bit of the story, right? So George, and I will say that this would easily be contested by Hampton University, but according to George Washington Fields, James was working at the time, but very close to General Armstrong. And so, as the founder, soon to be founder of Hampton, Armstrong asked, "What do you think of it, Jim? Do you think if we build the people will send in their children if we built a school here?" And he says, "Yes, certainly they will." He says, "Well, will you speak for the school? And when it opened, will you come?" He said, "Yes, indeed, General, I certainly will." And what's another part of this quotation too, that George gives down to us is James, you know many of the people here. Will you speak to them? And will you attend? James is still building community, building relationships, connecting with people. And then the last part of it, he says that he takes, General Armstrong takes James to the river, and it's the spot where he wants to build a school. He says, does it look nice? Do you think that they will come? And well before Field of Dreams, James has said, anywhere you put it, the people will come. Anywhere you put it, the people will come. And so James attends himself. Additionally, many others graduate from that in that same year. 14 men and 5 women graduate from the first graduating class at Hampton University. But his education doesn't stop there, and neither does his involvement with others. So remember, James is now connected with all of these people. He is very well connected, as well as Armstrong could see it in that point. And so in 1870, my apologies, in 1879, in the 1879-1880 session, a vacancy has entered or has opened up in the General Assembly for the doorkeeper of the House of Delegates. Now, this is another section that I've done quite a bit of research into, because one thing that we often seem to fail to know about our history in Virginia especially is just how many Black folks served in the General Assembly during Reconstruction.
There's pictures.
There are many, many pictures. And so there comes to a time where over 100 African-American men served in the General Assembly. Among them, Robert Norton. And James's connections are such that when that opening arrives, Robert Norton decides to nominate James for the position. And so he is elected by the General Assembly, not by the people, but by the General Assembly, the House of Delegates specifically, to serve as the doorkeeper for the House in his first elected position, but certainly not his last. He then goes on to get his law degree from Howard University. And when he's and after he comes back to Howard, he teaches law. He teaches in the same way that he'd been teaching, ends up teaching for 14 years after attending Hampton. And as he's teaching, as he's attending, he's also becoming Justice of the Peace. He is elected as Commonwealth's attorney. And then finally, in 1889, James is elected to the House of Delegates himself, joining that esteemed group of men who had been in the General Assembly. But he's also one of the very last. According to the records, he's in fact the last Black man to put a bill forward in the General Assembly before Jim Crow removes all Black men until William Ferguson Reed, 75 years later. Now, of course, the election of 1889 is another time where there's a lot of controversy, election fraud, ballot box stuffing. There are many issues there. And so 100 men, including James himself, gather in December in Richmond. And at Fisherman's Hall, right off of Broad Street, they are gathered here to address the problems and write a letter to Congress. James is appointed to the committee to address. And on here, this is what comes out of that committee. So we can glean a little bit of what James is thinking in that moment too. And so the committee itself, because I realize it's a little bit dense in the text-wise, so it might be a little bit too small for everyone to read from here. But I think I want to highlight most of all, the fact that it said it is far better to be without the franchise than to possess it only in name.
Mm-hmm.
Because they also recognize that if this is the way that it's going to be, then that means that their population still counts towards how many representatives are in Virginia, or given to Virginia, both in the United States Congress and in the General Assembly. And so other people will end up representing their population without needing any of them to vote for them. And so the committee to address issues states that this is the problem, and we would much rather not have the franchise. And in fact, you should remove the count from people who are not being represented. And so it is with this, though, in this setting, that James also seems to step away from the political life. He's worked toward this for quite some time. I mentioned before that the farm was near Hanover Courthouse. James was often the tender of the horses there. So he was hearing, according to the family traditions, he was actually hearing the law clerks as they were making their arguments, as the lawyers were making their arguments. And he had instilled a desire to learn law from that moment, back when he was still enslaved. And so to have that come all the way around, to have been elected to the General Assembly, and then realize that it's not something that he can continue in because of forces beyond his control. It must have been heartbreaking for him to come to that realization. But James, much like his brother, is possessed of an indomitable spirit. And simply because he's not necessarily engaged in politics does not mean that he's going to stop being engaged in general. And so he does eventually marry. He does he meets Carrie Washington, who becomes his wife. That is her in the picture over there. And he has his son, Sterling Fields. And Sterling is the one about whom he wrote in that in the 22 years of Hampton University, and where she calls him the finest boy in Christendom. One of those few quotations that we have directly from him. And so, noting these are the things that he is starting to realize, that's where he starts to put his investment, not necessarily in the political side of things, but in his family and in his community. Because James serves as, he teaches in churches, both the First Baptist Church in Williamsburg, my apologies. First Baptist Church in Williamsburg, as well as the Third Baptist Church of Hampton. He ends up teaching in those spaces. He is actively engaged with the Hampton YMCA. He's teaching law. He actually takes in his brother, George Washington Fields, who was the first Black man to graduate from Cornell Law School. He trains under him. And that is another point of pride that James takes in. It's reported in Emancipation, the book about the making of the Black lawyer, that every single one of James's students passed the bar on the first try. 3 times a week they were meeting with him, with the exception of July and August, which he took off for himself and his family. But he's invested in those places. And so when James dies in 1903, just as the 1902 Virginia Constitution is taking effect, completely then stripping the voting rights for 90% of African Americans, of Black men in Virginia. When he dies, he's built a legacy for himself. That legacy that comes in the form of the James A. Fields House, which was later turned into a hospital, one of the first in Newport News that was used for Black folks. The family that we have pictured up here is the legacy of James Apostle Fields as well. And so I brought back my mother's statement on here, and which I think is appropriate for this moment too, for the note that she put at the top of the second page. May you always keep the spirit of your doppelganger, James Apostle Fields, alive in your heart and find equal success in all you do in life. Because James died not an enslaved man, but a rather wealthy one, listed at having $25,000 worth of taxable property by the end of his life. And those things being passed down, instilled in his family, the same spirit that Martha Ann that used to carry her children into freedom. The same spirit that George Washington Fields used to carry his children into the next generation of lawyers as well. That same spirit is passed down throughout the family. And so I reflect now on the fact that in 2020, we were able to get a historic marker dedicated to the Fields family, right outside the courthouse in Hanover, just right by where Louisa was sold on a stump down to Georgia. And now that Martha Ann Fields building next door, and the sign here stating clearly that the Fields family was here, is an important step for us recognizing our own history. Now, as my mother said, there is a doppelganger situation going on. So I went ahead. There's James here, and then there is me on this side. When I was running for city council in 2020, I drew a lot of inspiration from James, because there were several, while he was in the General Assembly, he puts forth several different bills, 5 in total, but many of them were about his constituents, on behalf of his constituents. And pulling that kind of same spirit of service is what helped me through a very, very tough year for all of us, but what encouraged me to actually myself seek public office. But that was trying to understand James from that 2019 view, trying to go into this commemoration event and thinking, how am I going to embody this man? And I had thought, at various points in time, I had thought, maybe there's just not enough for me to go on here. I'm used to being able to see pages upon pages of things about people so that I can know more what they're thinking, more what they would have gone through. And so when I had initially created this, I was thinking to myself, how can we use other stories to help augment James's story? How do we take snippets of what we know about different people and pop that in there? But in the spirit of service that is endemic to the Fields family, by the time I was finished this presentation, I realized something. That's not what this is about. James has a rich story. He has a lot of documented evidence. It is not his story that needs to be enhanced, but all the others who might not have as much. I want to know more about the other people on that census, that slave schedule of 1850. I want to know more about that young woman who loosened his bonds as he was making his second attempt for freedom. I want to know more about the men who helped him and one of whom seized his freedom with him. I want to know more about the other people who were in his orbit, who he felt were so important as to mention that he had taught them, that he had worked with them, that he devoted his time to them. I want to know more about them, and I want that James's story to be able to enhance theirs and not the other way around. So as I come to you with this, the work is not yet complete, because I realized in the making of this that what is next is finding everyone else, is bringing the family together, that constellation of connections that James made throughout his lifetime. He was relatively young when he died, at least by Fields' measurements. I will say that my great-grandmother was 101 years old when she passed, and that her mother was 109. There's a picture of me with her, in fact. Wow. And so there is a constellation of people that James intersected with, that he met with. And I want to dedicate my exploration of the Fields family to their stories. And so hopefully, if I have the pleasure of standing before you again, I will have an entire other constellation of stories to be able to tell you, because there are more resources out there than ever before. I know everyone here has been to ancestry.com, right? Even if you haven't used it, you know it's there. And you can get to the records in the Library of Virginia, but also right here in this building, something that I never thought about looking at before. We have one of the largest collection of private business records in Virginia history, in this building here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. There are a number of additional ways in which we can explore our shared history together. And from this Fields descendant to all those whom we have intersected with over generations now, I want to make sure that we are dedicating our thoughts and our abilities to actually making sure that those voices are heard as well. So with that, I will yield the floor, as it were, and thank you so much for listening today.
I think it's appropriate if we have questions, though.
Oh, absolutely. I am able to answer any questions. I want to stop sharing my screen for a little bit here, if I can make that work.
There are some messages in the chat. Did you check those?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, I see messages in the chat too. It is beautiful, does not look like the same place. Yes, if you haven't been to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture since the renovation, please come on out. I will say right now, if you just let me know that you heard it from attending here, I'll get you in no charge. You will be my personal guest to show you around the place, because it truly is a reimagined museum. A reimagined space that is dedicated to sharing the stories of all Virginians. And that is very well implemented on here.
I just have a question.
Yes.
Where is the family burial site that you have? Is it at a church that he passed to?
Pleasant Shades Cemetery, if I'm remembering that correctly. And that's one of those ones that I have on my notepad, which is of course upstairs. And I'll make sure that I give you the exact answer on that. But he is buried in a place separate from some of the rest of the family, in fact. But yes, he is buried down in the Hampton Newport News area too.
Can you repeat the questions for online?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Wonderful presentation. I was very intrigued with all the information. I actually did a presentation on George A. Fields. And so learning about James A. Fields was interesting, because in the book, now I'm getting everything confused. So I have a question.
Yes.
So George ended up blind.
Yes.
So, but James he's not blind.
No,
Okay.
James is not blind.
All right, so
Only
the brother. Okay.
So the question being, was George was the one who he lost his sight, and he continued to practice, but he did lose his sight. Now James died well earlier than George did, and so he, like I said, relatively young at 59, and he died of what they claim was Bright's disease. So that is what caused his passing out.
Great book. So will you be doing a book on James A. Fields?
You know what? If I can give the amount of additional evidence to highlight those other voices, I absolutely will do a book on James A. Fields. Yes.
There's a comment in the chat from your mother.
Oh no. Yes. Oh yes. Drusilla Pear, who is also on the call today, I believe, was hand in glove working with my mother to uncover stories about the Fields family. And definitely the Hampton area AAHGS as well are all involved in that. My mother and Drusilla did a presentation on Martha Ann's life that was just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I remember when she was talking about it, she was using some imagery at the time of a video that I had done in Pennsylvania of a fugitive, a runaway in Pennsylvania. And she was reflecting on, at the time, I was 17 years old, dressed in this outfit. And that was the same age that James was when he was making that same escape. And so through their work specifically, they really put together a lot through the work of doctors, George and Sandra Cherry down in Hampton. They preserved the James A. Fields house. And so it is on the National Register of Historic Places because of their work. And like I said, Dr. Claremont's in the chat as well, whose work on bringing the story of George Washington Fields really helped inform a lot of our family research in this later on. So make sure I get as many people. Pleasant Shade, that's it. Pleasant Shade.
Does Drusilla want to speak because she's unmuted?
Yes, Drusilla, would you like to say anything? I know you. This is all you do.
I'd just like to thank you, Joseph, for taking on the work that we've compiled. You are the inheritor of all this hard work, and you're the next generation and keeping it going. I am so very proud of you. It's a great presentation of compiling and putting your own take on it, on what we have done. I'm just very happy to see you in your role and see you embracing your heritage. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for
Can
what
you bring
you've
the
done.
Zoom people up?
Oh, yeah, I can
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah, that's a good one.
I'm going to move the screen over so everybody can see.
All right.
There we go. Yes, so if you were looking at that, we've got a whole bunch of folks on. Are there any other questions? Yes,
Any chance that your PowerPoint presentation is going to be made available?
I can make the
Repeat
PowerPoint
question,
presentation.
please. Repeat the question.
Oh, yes. So the question was, would the PowerPoint presentation be made available? And I can absolutely make the PowerPoint presentation available for folks. I would like to add some more captions to it before I do that, just so that you'll know where the images came from, how to utilize them, and you'll have a better understanding of it. Because like I said before, I am still in that military presentation of here's what you got, right? So I want to make sure that that is available for folks to actually utilize for a good purpose, and it would be useful for you.
Sounds great. Can you flip the camera around so that they can see us?
For everyone who can see
There we
you all.
go.
So this is our crowd here. Yep. Look at that. This is how hybrid meetings are hard to pull off. I hope we did a good job today.
Oh, that's Regina.
Yes, it is. That's my mom right up there. There she is. She's in the car.
She's in the car. Is she outdoors?
Yep, yep. I thought she was driving over here, but I guess I was wrong. Just kidding. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
in Newport News, getting ready to go see my mom. So just loving all of this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah, and
we
our
say what she does?
oh yes. So for those of you who do not know, my mother, Gina Rogers, is the supervisory ranger at Maggie Walker National Historic Site for the moment. Mom, what are you going to be doing in just a week or so?
Going home.
Yeah, going home actually. Starting Monday, I will be the acting as the supervisory ranger for visitor service and resource management at Fort Monroe.
So resource management.
Following Martha Ann's path. You got James, I got Martha Ann.
There we go. So it is a homecoming in that sense, because that space where the reunion of the family happened is now where mom gets to do some really great work. So we're really excited about this, even though she told me only when she had 2 weeks to go. But sorry, I called you out, mom. So I want to go over here.
We couldn't hear what she said. Could
Oh.
she repeat that for us?
Yes, mom, could you repeat one more time what you're going to be doing at Fort Monroe?
Sure. So I'm going to be for 4 months on a detail. I will be at Fort Monroe as the Visitors Services and Resource Management Supervisor, working with Yola Dance and all of those who are at all the descendants who are at Fort Monroe. So great opportunity.
So can we get a field trip together in that amount of time?
That'd be great.
Richmond AAHGS is on the way.
All right, doors will be open for you.
All right, I saw one last question I want to get to.
Mr. Fields, thank you so much for today's presentation. And just showing an in-depth portrait of just one of the over 100 African-American delegates that served in the Virginia General Assembly. As a former member of the Virginia General Assembly, I was really intrigued when in the 1990s, 2000s, I saw portraits of these Black legislators. Yeah. There was nowhere else in the General Assembly buildings at the state capitol where they were memorialized. I set upon a personal journey to make sure all 102, I think it was 102 Black legislators that served between 1867, and I think the last one actually was in 1902, 1901, going out the door, that their names are permanently engraved on a plaque at the Virginia Capitol. And I think Virginia is the only state, I might be wrong, but I think Virginia is the only state that has these Black legislators doing the Reconstruction era so memorialized. So I would love to put it out as a challenge for AAHGS members, especially AAHGS members in Virginia, to do as much in-depth research on the others that were history trailmakers. So, but thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for your work. I do remember actually being invited to have the plaque for the dedication. I was in Pennsylvania at the time and didn't make it down, but I remember when we heard about it, how important it was for our family to feel and to know that that was happening. So thank you especially for that work as well.
It was a power.
All right. All right, so that is it for us, I guess. Are there any other questions for folks who are virtual? I want to get this on the road so we can show you all the new museums. All right, well, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Larry, and we'll move on from there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we start to call you Mr. Fields. Don't feel bad about that.
Oh, my computer battery's not here, but
I just want to thank everyone, especially those that are online, for coming to our meeting today. We are going to move to our session where we're going to take a tour. Hopefully everyone here can accompany us. And just want to announce our next session will be the end of August. And stay tuned on our website to what's going to happen in our next session. It'll be a workshop session. And maybe it'll be here. We'll see. So thank you all online. We're gonna cut the Zoom session. And we're going to move on to our tour of the museum. Okay, thank you very much.
Do you want to take a picture, Dale?
Yeah, before everyone leaves, can we just get a group shot